Picture this. You're 6 years old, playing with dolls in your father's palace. Then one day, you're told you're leaving everything behind to marry a king you've never met. A king who's 29 years old, in a foreign country where you don't speak the language. This wasn't a nightmare. This was reality for Isabella of Valois in 1396. Today, we're diving into the extraordinary true story of a French princess who became Queen of England before she could even understand what marriage meant. A story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about medieval politics, childhood, and the price of peace. Before we begin, if you're fascinated by these forgotten chapters of history, hit that like button and subscribe for more. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love knowing we're exploring these ancient stories together from around the world. Isabella was born on November 9th, 1389, in the Louvre Palace in Paris. She should have had a fairy tale childhood. Instead, she grew up in a court shadowed by her father's terrifying illness. King Charles VI of France suffered from episodes of what historians believe was schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder. History remembers him as Charles the Mad, and his madness shaped Isabella's entire childhood. One moment, her father might shower her with affection. The next, he'd be screaming that assassins were coming for him. Sometimes he believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. Other times, he refused to bathe for months, convinced that water would poison him. Palace servants would rush the children away during these episodes, but the trauma lingered. Isabella learned early that power was fragile, that kings could fall, and that nothing in life was certain. While Isabella's father battled his demons, England and France were locked in a war that had already consumed 2 generations. The 100 Years' War had devastated both kingdoms. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. Trust me, we're just getting started. French villages lay in ruins. English treasuries were empty. Both sides were exhausted, their people desperate for peace. And in medieval Europe, peace between kingdoms was sealed with marriage. Royal marriages were treaties written in flesh and blood. This is where 6-year-old Isabella became a pawn in a deadly political game. Across the English Channel, King Richard II was mourning. His beloved wife, Anne of Bohemia, had died from plague in 1394. By all accounts, theirs had been a genuine love match, rare among royal unions. Richard was devastated. The last thing he wanted was to replace Anne. But he was a king without an heir, and his advisors were insistent. He needed to remarry. When French ambassadors arrived with their proposal, Richard listened carefully. They weren't just offering a bride. They were offering an end to the war. The French offer was unprecedented in its scope. A dowry of 800,000 francs, enough to refill England's depleted war chest. A 28-year truce, long enough for an entire generation to grow up knowing peace. And the hand of Princess Isabella in marriage. There was just one massive problem. Isabella was only 6 years old. Even by medieval standards, this was shockingly young. Most royal brides were at least entering adolescence, but the French negotiators had an argument ready. Isabella's youth was actually an advantage. She would grow up at the English court, learning English ways, speaking English, becoming English in everything but blood. By the time she was old enough to truly be queen, She would unite both kingdoms in her very person. To address concerns, the negotiators included an explicit clause in the treaty. The marriage would not be consummated until Isabella reached physical maturity. This protection was written into the official documents, sealed with wax and witnessed by nobles from both kingdoms. Richard's counselors were divided. Some saw strategic genius, others worried about the scandal of marrying such a young child. But Richard himself was apparently moved by something else. Perhaps the grieving, childless king saw not just a political alliance, but a daughter to protect and guide. After months of negotiations, the deal was done. On October 31st, 1396, in the English-controlled port of Calais, 7-year-old Isabella was married to 29-year-old King Richard II. She wore a gown of gold cloth so heavy with embroidery and pearls that attendants had to help her walk. When it came time to exchange rings, Richard knelt down to her level. Witnesses noted how gently he lifted her chin when she seemed frightened by all the nobles staring at her. The ceremony was intimate, but its significance was enormous. This marriage was supposed to end 60 years of brutal warfare. A year later, Isabella was crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey. This time, the ceremony was anything but intimate. Massive crowds flooded London, desperate to catch a glimpse of the famous child queen. The coronation was spectacular, a show of royal power designed to prove that England stood behind this unusual marriage. Isabella processed through London streets in a decorated litter, wearing a crown specially made for her small head. People died in the crush to see her. That's how massive the crowds were. After the coronation, Richard established Isabella in her own apartments at Westminster Palace. Her household was carefully arranged to blend French and English attendants. Her days were filled with lessons, English language, court etiquette, music, needlework, and the complex political dance of royal life. Richard took an active interest in her education. Chronicles describe him visiting her regularly, bringing gifts, exotic birds, fine books, musical instruments. He seemed genuinely fond of her, and she began to look forward to his visits. But this wasn't a normal childhood. Isabella was learning to be a queen, while she should have been learning to be a child. For 3 years, Isabella's life in England was relatively stable. She learned English, made friends with other noble children at court, and gradually adjusted to her role. She was safe under Richard's protection. But in 1399, everything collapsed. Richard's cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, returned to England with an army. Technically, he claimed he just wanted his inheritance back. In reality, he wanted the throne. And many English nobles who had long resented Richard's rule flocked to Henry's banner. Isabella first realized something was wrong when her English ladies-in-waiting disappeared overnight. Then she heard shouting from the courtyard. Looking out her window, she saw armed men in unfamiliar colors. That night, she was moved to the Tower of London, both palace and prison. The comfortable apartments she'd known were replaced with rooms that were clearly designed to contain her. When Richard came to see her, Isabella barely recognized him. The confident king had been replaced by a haunted, disheveled man who looked like he'd aged years in weeks. For the first time, Richard spoke to her not as a child, but as a political equal. He explained that Henry was claiming the throne, that his support had crumbled, that he might not be able to protect her anymore. "What will happen to me?" 9-year-old Isabella asked. "I don't know," Richard admitted, and that uncertainty tormented him. Within weeks, Richard was forced to abdicate. Henry IV took the throne. And Richard? He died in captivity at Pontefract Castle under mysterious circumstances. Most historians believe he was murdered on Henry's orders. Isabella had lost her protector. The gentle king who had treated her with paternal kindness was gone, and she was now a very valuable, very vulnerable prisoner in a hostile court. Henry IV had a problem. What to do with Isabella? Some advisors urged him to send her back to France immediately. Others argued she was valuable leverage against the French king. Isabella herself played her cards brilliantly for a 9-year-old. She was unfailingly polite, but maintained her dignity as queen. She never gave offense, but she never forgot who she was. Her French ladies-in-waiting proved crucial. They helped her navigate the dangerous politics of Henry's court, teaching her when to speak and when to stay silent. Finally, in 1400, Henry made Isabella an offer. She could return to France, but only if she formally acknowledged him as rightful King of England and renounced any claims to the English throne. At 10 years old, Isabella had to make an impossible choice: accept exile and admit her 3 years as queen had been meaningless, or refuse and remain a prisoner indefinitely. In the end, her father decided for her. King Charles VI, during a lucid period, demanded his daughter's immediate return. Faced with the threat of renewed war with France, Henry agreed. In the summer of 1401, Isabella left England. She was abandoning the only home she'd known for 5 years. The apartments where she'd learned English, the gardens where she'd played, the great hall where she'd been crowned. But she was also returning to a family that had become foreign to her. She now spoke French with an English accent. She preferred English fashions. She had to relearn French court etiquette. The 6-year-old girl who'd left Paris had returned as an 11-year-old young woman, shaped by experiences her French relatives couldn't understand. Back in France, Isabella's status as a former Queen of England made her both valuable and complicated as a marriage prospect. Several nobles were interested, but one stood out: her cousin, Charles, Duke of Orléans. Charles was 29, the same age Richard had been when he married Isabella, but this time the age gap mattered less. Isabella was now approaching 14, and this marriage was her choice. Charles treated her as an equal, respecting her intelligence and experience. He was cultured, passionate about arts and literature, and he seemed to genuinely see her as a person, not just a political asset. They married in 1406, and for the first time in her life, Isabella experienced what it meant to be truly loved and respected. Isabella threw herself into her new life. She became a patron of arts and literature. She had 3 children: Jean in 1407, Charles in 1408, and Margaret in 1409. She was determined to give her children the stable, loving childhood she'd never had. She insisted on nursing them herself, scandalous for a duchess. She was present, engaged, protective. For a few brief years, Isabella knew genuine happiness, but medieval life was brutal and short. The complications from Margaret's birth in 1409 nearly killed Isabella. She survived, but her health was permanently damaged. She lived just 4 more months. On September 13th, 1409, Isabella of Valois died. She was only 20 years old. Isabella lived just 2 decades, but what a life she packed into those years. Married at 6, widowed at 9, a political prisoner at 10, happily married at 16, a mother at 17, dead at 20. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the past. Yes, her childhood marriage horrifies us today. But within the brutal constraints of her era, Isabella showed remarkable courage, intelligence, and resilience. She was dealt an impossible hand, and she played it with dignity. She survived courts that would have destroyed weaker people. She found love after trauma. She created beauty and meaning in a harsh world. Isabella of Valois wasn't just a victim of medieval politics. She was a survivor who refused to let circumstances define her entirely. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe for more forgotten histories. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. And tell me in the comments, what aspect of Isabella's story affected you most? Thanks for watching. Until next time, keep exploring the past.